The wind howled through the pines like a pack of wolves on the hunt, rattling the shutters of the isolated cabin nestled between the jagged peaks of the Black Ridge Mountains. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting long shadows that danced across the rough-hewn walls. Elias and Caleb Mercer, the infamous Mercer twins, sat hunched over the table, their massive frames barely contained by the splintered chairs. Their beards were thick with the grime of weeks spent trapping and hunting, their eyes sharp as flint, reflecting the flickering flames. Across from them, Clara Hargrove, the sheriff's wife, sat with her back straight as a rifle barrel. Her golden hair, usually pinned up in a neat bun, had come loose during the ride up the mountain, and now it spilled over her shoulders like a cascade of sunlight. She had come seeking their help. Her husband, Sheriff Tom Hargrove, had ridden out 3 days prior to track a gang of outlaws holed up in the high passes, and he hadn't returned. The twins were the only men foolhardy enough to brave the storm rolling in, and desperate enough to take on the job. Elias, the elder by a mere 5 minutes, leaned forward, his calloused fingers tracing the rim of his tin cup. "You sure your husband ain't just lost his way, ma'am?" His voice was rough, like gravel underfoot, but there was a hint of something softer beneath it. "These mountains got a way of swallowin' men whole." Clara's blue eyes flashed. "Tom knows these mountains better'n most. He wouldn't get turned around, not with what's at stake." She reached into her coat pocket and slid a crumpled wanted poster across the table. The ink was smudged, but the faces were clear, ugly, scarred men with dead eyes. The Black Ridge Butchers. They've been terrorizin' the valley for months. Burned the Miller's homestead last week. Tom rode out to end it. Now he's missin', and I aim to find him." Caleb chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to shake the very timbers of the cabin. "Ain't no lawman's wife ever rode into our camp a skin for help for. Reckon that makes you special, Clara." He said her name like he was tasting it, savoring the way it rolled off his tongue. Elias shot him a warning glance, but Caleb just grinned, unfazed. Clara ignored the undertone in his voice. "I ain't a skin for charity. I got gold in my saddlebags, enough to pay for your trouble. All I need is 2 men who ain't afraid of a little bloodshed." Elias scratched his beard, considering. The twins had a reputation. Men who lived by their own code, who answered to no sheriff, no law. But there was something about the way Clara held herself, the fire in her eyes, that made him hesitate. "Storm's comin'," he said finally. "We ride out now, we ain't comin' back till it's done. You sure you're ready for that?" Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I was ready the moment Tom didn't come home. You in or not?" The twins exchanged a look, one of those silent conversations only brothers who'd shared a womb could have. Then, as one, they pushed back from the table and stood. "Ain't no storm ever stopped us," Caleb said, grabbing his coat from the peg by the door. "But we do this our way. No questions asked, no rules but ours." Clara nodded, her jaw set. "Fair enough." Outside, the wind had picked up, whipping the snow into a frenzy. The twins moved with an easy confidence, saddling their horses with practiced efficiency. Clara mounted her mare, her gloved hands steady on the reins. Elias swung up onto his massive stallion, the beast snorting steam into the cold air. Caleb paused beside Clara, his breath misting between them. "You ride with us, you're one of us. That means something out here." She met his gaze, unflinching. "I understand." With that, they set off, the storm swallowing them whole. The trail was treacherous, the snow falling in thick, wet flakes that clung to their coats and blurred the path ahead. Clara rode between the twins, her mare sure-footed despite the slick terrain. The higher they climbed, the more the wind screamed, tearing at their clothes like a living thing. Elias took the lead, his eyes sharp for any sign of Tom or the butchers. Caleb rode beside Clara, his presence a solid, comforting weight against the howling gale. "You ever kill a man before, Clara?" Caleb's voice cut through the wind, casual, as if he were asking about the weather. She didn't look at him. "No. First time's the hardest. But something tells me you got the stomach for it." Clara gripped the reins tighter. "I ain't here to kill anyone. Just find my husband." Caleb laughed, a dark, knowing sound. Out here, those two things tend to go hand in hand. A gunshot echoed through the mountains, sharp and sudden. The horses reared, their eyes rolling white with panic. Elias cursed, wheeling his stallion around. "That came from up ahead. Stay close." They urged their horses forward, the snow crunching beneath the hooves. The gunfire had come from a narrow pass, the walls of rock rising like the jaws of some ancient beast. As they approached, the acrid scent of smoke filled the air, mingling with a metallic tang of blood. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Then she saw him. Tom was slumped against a boulder, his hat gone, his face streaked with blood. His revolver lay in the snow beside him, its barrel still smoking. 3 bodies were sprawled nearby, their coats dark with blood, their faces frozen in expressions of surprise. The Blackridge butchers, or what was left of them. Clara slid from her mare before the horse had even stopped moving, her boots sinking into the snow as she ran to her husband. "Tom!" She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his wounds, unsure where to touch, where to help. Tom's eyes fluttered open, his voice a rasping whisper. "Clara, shouldn't we come?" "Hush now," she said, pressing her hand to his side, trying to staunch the bleeding. "We're gettin' you outta here." Elias and Caleb dismounted, their expressions grim as they took in the scene. "Looks like your husband did most of the work for us," Elias said, but there was no triumph in his voice. Only respect. Caleb knelt beside Clara, his massive frame blocking the wind. "We'll get him back to the cabin. You ride with him, keep him warm. Elias and I'll handle the rest." Clara nodded, her throat tight with gratitude. Together, they lifted Tom onto her mare, his body limp between them. Clara mounted behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist, holding him upright. The twins moved swiftly, gathering the butcher's horses and stripping the bodies of anything useful. Guns, ammunition, a pouch of gold coins that clinked heavily in Caleb's hand. "Looks like your husband hit the jackpot," Caleb said, tossing the pouch to Clara. "Enough here to start over, if you're of a mind to." Clara tucked the pouch into her coat, her eyes never leaving Tom's pale face. "Let's just get him home." The ride back to the cabin was a blur of snow and silence, broken only by the labored breathing of the horses and the occasional groan from Tom. Clara kept her arms tight around him, her body pressed close to share what little warmth she could. The twins rode ahead and behind, their rifles across their laps, eyes scanning the darkness. The storm had worsened, the wind now a relentless force that threatened to tear them from their saddles. But the Mercer brothers rode as if the weather meant nothing, their focus unwavering. By the time they reached the cabin, Tom's breathing had grown shallow, his skin clammy beneath Clara's touch. The twins moved with surprising gentleness, helping her lower him onto the bed near the fire. Elias stoked the flames while Caleb fetched water and bandages from the shelves. Clara worked quickly, her hands steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. She stripped off Tom's blood-soaked shirt, revealing the ugly gash across his ribs. A bullet had grazed him, tearing through flesh and leaving a trail of ruin. "Need to clean it," Caleb muttered, handing her a bottle of whiskey. "Pour it over the wound. It'll burn like hell, but it'll keep the rot out." Clara hesitated only a second before uncorking the bottle. Tom's eyes snapped open, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Clara, don't." She poured. Tom's body arched off the bed, a guttural scream tearing from his throat. Clara held him down, her own breath coming in ragged gasps as she watched the whiskey sizzle against his raw flesh. The scent of alcohol and blood filled the cabin, sharp and metallic. When it was done, Tom collapsed back onto the bed, his face slick with sweat, his eyes glazed with pain. Elias pressed a wad of clean cloth against the wound, his voice low. "He'll live, long as the fever don't take him. But he ain't ridin' nowhere for a while." Clara's hands trembled as she wrapped the bandage around Tom's ribs, securing it tightly. She looked up at the twins, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you." Caleb waved a hand, dismissing her gratitude. "Ain't nothin'. Man like your husband deserves respect. Ain't many lawmen got the grit to take on the butchers alone." Elias moved to the cabin's single window, pulling the shutters closed against the storm. "We'll stay till he's on his feet. Ain't safe for you out here alone." Clara swallowed hard, nodding. She knew what that meant. Days, maybe weeks, trapped in this cabin with two men who lived by their own rules, who answered to no one. Men who had a reputation that stretched across the territories, whispered in saloons and around campfires. Men who were as dangerous as they were loyal. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind howled like a pack of wolves, but inside, the cabin was warm, the air thick with the scent of pine and smoke. Clara pulled a chair close to the bed, her fingers brushing Tom's forehead. He was burning up, his skin hot to the touch. She wet a cloth and pressed it to his brow, her mind racing. She had ridden into the mountains seeking help, and she had found it. But now, with the storm raging and her husband wounded, she was at the mercy of the Mercer twins. And mercy wasn't something they were known for. The night stretched on, the hours marked only by the shifting of the fire and the occasional groan from Tom. Clara dozed in the chair, her head resting against the bed frame, her body exhausted but her mind too wired to sleep. She wasn't sure what woke her, the silence, perhaps, or the absence of Tom's restless movements. She sat up, blinking in the dim light, and saw Elias standing by the fire, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. "He's sleepin'," Elias said, his voice quiet. "Fever broke an hour ago. He'll make it." Clara exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Thank God. Caleb was at the table, sharpening his knife with slow, methodical strokes. He looked up as she stood, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before returning to his task. "You oughta get some rest. Ain't nothin' more you can do for him tonight." Clara hesitated. The bed was barely large enough for Tom, and she had no intention of leaving his side. But the chair was unforgiving, her body aching from the long ride and the hours spent hunched over him. She moved to the hearth, sinking down onto the floor beside the fire. The heat seeped into her bones, easing the stiffness in her muscles. She pulled her knees to her chest, watching the flames dance. Elias sat across from her, his massive frame dwarfing the space. "You're a strong woman, Clara Hargrove," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "Ain't many would have ridden into the mountains alone, seekin' men like us." Clara met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. "I did what I had to." Caleb chuckled, the sound low and knowing. "Ain't that the truth?" He set the knife aside, leaning back in his chair. "You ever think about leavin' this life behind? Takin' your husband someplace where the law don't mean nothin' but trouble?" Clara frowned. "Tom's the law. It's all he's ever known. And look where it got him," Caleb said, nodding toward the bed. "Men like your husband, they got a target on their back the size of Texas. Sooner or later, someone's gonna put a bullet in it." Elias shot his brother a warning look, but Caleb ignored him, his eyes locked on Clara. "You could do better. Find a place where the only thing that matters is what you make of it. No sheriff's badge, no wanted posters. Just you and the land." Clara's fingers tightened around her knees. "You talkin' about yourselves?" Caleb's grin was slow, dangerous. "We ain't tied to nothin', Clara. Ain't no law we answer to, no town we call home. We go where we please, take what we want. And right now, what we want is to help you." The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. There was a promise in his words, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the fire. "I appreciate the offer, but my place is with Tom." Elias stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Enough talk. We all need rest. Storm ain't lettin' up any time soon." Clara didn't argue. She moved back to the chair beside the bed, her mind racing. The twins were offering her a way out, a chance to leave behind the life that had nearly cost Tom everything. But it was a life built on freedom at any cost, on violence and survival. She wasn't sure she could live like that. And she wasn't sure she could refuse. The storm raged for 3 more days, trapping them inside the cabin like animals in a snare. The world outside was a white void, the wind howling so fiercely it shook the timbers and sent drafts whispering through the cracks in the walls. Clara tended to Tom, changing his bandages, spooning broth into his mouth when he was strong enough to swallow. The twins kept the fire stoked, hunted what little game they could find in the storm's brief lulls, and watched her with eyes that missed nothing. By the fourth morning, Tom's strength had returned enough for him to sit up, his face still pale but his gaze sharp. He listened as Clara recounted the ride into the mountains, the battle with the butchers, and the twins' role in saving his life. His jaw tightened when she mentioned the gold, the bounty the outlaws had been carrying. "That money ain't ours," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "It belongs to the families they robbed." Caleb, lounging against the wall with his arms crossed, smirked. "Ain't no families left to claim it, Sheriff. Butchers burned 'em out. That gold's as good as abandoned." Tom's eyes flicked to Clara, then back to the twins. "Don't matter. It ain't honest money. We turn it in." Elias, who had been sharpening his rifle, set the weapon aside. "You always this stubborn, Hargrove? Only when it comes to doin' what's right." Caleb pushed off the wall, his movements slow, deliberate. "Right's a mighty flexible word out here, Sheriff. You of all people oughta know that." Clara could feel the tension coiling in the room like a rattler ready to strike. She stepped between them, her voice firm. "Tom's right. That money don't belong to us. We'll see it return to the town when we get back." Tom reached for her hand, his grip weak but steady. "Thank you, Clara." Caleb's expression darkened, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned and grabbed his coat from the peg by the door. "Storm's breakin'. We ride at first light." The morning dawned clear and cold, the storm's fury spent, leaving the world blanketed in snow so pristine it hurt to look at. The twins saddled their horses with efficient silence, their breath misting in the frigid air. Clara helped Tom into his coat, her hands lingering on his shoulders. He was still weak, but his determination burned brighter than the fire in the hearth. "I can ride," he insisted, though his voice betrayed the effort it cost him. Elias didn't argue. He simply handed Tom the reins to his horse and helped him mount. Caleb watched from a distance, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Clara swung up onto her mare, her gloved hands steady on the reins. The twins mounted their own horses, their rifles slung across their backs. The ride down the mountain was slower than the ascent had been, the snow deep and the air thin. Tom rode beside Clara, his posture rigid with pain, but his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. The twins took the lead, their horses sure-footed even on the treacherous slopes. The silence between them was heavy, charged with something Clara couldn't name. They made camp that night in a sheltered cleft of rock, the fire small but enough to ward off the worst of the cold. Tom sat with his back against a boulder, his face drawn but his spirit unbroken. Clara sat beside him, her shoulder pressed to his, sharing what warmth she could. The twins sat across the fire, their faces half-lit by the flickering flames. Elias broke the silence first. "You ever think about what comes after, Sheriff? After the badge, the law, all of it?" Tom's gaze didn't waver. "Ain't nothin' after. This is my life. Even if it gets you killed?" Caleb's voice was soft, almost gentle. "Even if it leaves your wife a widow?" Clara's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Tom, but his eyes were fixed on the twins, his expression unreadable. Tom exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the cold air. "A man's got to stand for something. If it ain't the law, then what is it?" Caleb's grin was sharp, dangerous. "Freedom, Sheriff. The kind you ain't never known." Tom didn't answer. He simply reached for Clara's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. The message was clear. The twins exchanged a glance, something unspoken passing between them. Then, as one, they stood. "We'll take first watch," Elias said, his voice gruff. "You two get some rest." Clara watched them go, their massive forms disappearing into the darkness. She leaned her head against Tom's shoulder, her mind racing. The twins had saved his life, had offered her a way out of the cycle of violence and loss that defined their existence. But Tom was her husband, her anchor in a world that made less and less sense with each passing day. Tom pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice barely above a whisper. "You ever wonder what it'd be like to just walk away?" Clara closed her eyes, the weight of his words settling over her like a mantle. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know I can't lose you, Tom. Not to this. Not to anything." Tom was silent for a long moment. Then, softly, he said, "Then we find a way. Together." The next morning, they rode into the valley as the sun crested the mountains, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. The town of Blackridge lay ahead, its buildings small and dark against the white expanse. Clara could see the smoke rising from the chimneys, the distant figures of people moving about their daily lives. It was a sight she had taken for granted once, but now it filled her with a strange, aching longing. The twins reined in their horses as they reached the edge of town, their expressions unreadable. Elias tipped his hat to Clara, his voice rough. "You take care, ma'am. And you, Sheriff." He didn't offer his hand, and Tom didn't extend his. There was no need for words between them. They understood each other in a way that went beyond language. Caleb lingered for a moment longer, his gaze locked on Clara. "You change your mind," he said, his voice low. "You know where to find us." Then, with a final nod, he turned his horse and rode away, Elias falling in beside him. Clara watched them go, their forms growing smaller until they disappeared into the trees. Tom exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the cold air. "They're dangerous men, Clara." She didn't look at him. "I know. But they saved my life. And mine," she said softly. Tom was silent for a long moment. Then, gently, he urged his horse forward, toward the town, toward the life they had built together. Clara followed, her heart heavy with questions she couldn't answer. The gold in her saddlebags felt like a brand, a reminder of the choices she had made and the ones still to come. As they rode down the main street, the townsfolk stopped to stare, their faces a mix of relief and awe. The sheriff was alive. The butchers were gone. The town was safe. But Clara knew the truth. Nothing was ever truly safe. Not out here. Not in a world where men like the Mercer twins existed, where the line between right and wrong was as thin and fragile as the ice on a winter pond. She looked back one last time, toward the mountains, toward the wilderness that had nearly claimed them all. Somewhere out there, the twins were riding, free and untamed, answerable to no one. And for the first time, Clara wondered what that freedom would feel like.